All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our March session of the Radical Philosophy Hour. My name is Jake Bartholomew, as usual, and I am joined here by Dr. Sergio Armando Gallegos Rodica, Associate Professor of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and Dr. Obed Frauster, Lecturer at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. I would like to begin with Sergio. His talk is called The Radical Philosophical Thought of Ignacio Ramirez El Nigromante. So welcome, Sergio.
Thank you so much, Jake. So let me share my screen. All right, so I'm going to be discussing the radical philosophical thought of Ignacio Ramirez el Nigromante, who was a 19th century Mexican liberal thinker uh, who had developed a very interesting radical naturalism that gave rise to a pioneering vision of associative democracy, individual autonomy, and transformative education.
All right.
So the central argument of my paper is that Ramirez embraced a radical naturalism that led him to defend an associative notion of democracy as the best way to promote individual autonomy. And he also embraced the view that education is central to enabling people to engage in democratic processes. Uh, in virtue of this, one of the other points that I'm going to be defending is that there are significant parallels between Ramirez's views and those of John Dewey, the famous uh, US and US philosopher and educator. And this suggests the existence of deep affinities between Mexican liberalism and US pragmatism, likely because both thinkers face similar historical challenges. So let me say a few things with respect to 19th century Mexico, which is the environment in which Jose Ramirez El Nigromante was born and raised. So after the Independence War, which lasted from 1810 to 1821, Mexico faced very deep challenges building a new political regime, also resisting imperialistic threats from the US and from France and from other European nations, and trying to forge a national identity across deep economic, linguistic, and social racial divides that were inherited from the colonial period. And two of the main forces that acted upon this upon the situation that Mexico faced, two intellectual traditions were on the one side the conservative tradition that was inspired by the Irish thinker Edmund Burke, uh, and people who subscribed to this tradition typically defended constitutional monarchy. They also defended the preservation of church privileges, which are called fueros in the Spanish tradition, and that upheld basically social hierarchies for the sake of order and stability. And in contrast to this conservative tradition, which was upheld by historians and thinkers like Lucas Alaman, there was also a liberal tradition that was essentially inspired by Spinoza and Saint-Simon. And this liberal tradition advocated for an egalitarian republic instead of a constitutional monarchy. They also defended the elimination of any special privileges from the church or from other groups. They advocated for freedom of thought, and they also defended the idea of a radical social transformation to really turn the page on the colonial period. So this is the setting in which El Nigromante was born, lived, and uh, uh, wrote his works. So who was Ignacio Ramirez El Nigromante? So Ignacio Ramirez El Nigromante was born in 1818 in Guanajuato during the Independence War. He was very much shaped by the influence of his father, who was a liberal thinker, and by the educator Juan Rodriguez at the Colegio de San Gregorio, where he had the chance of reading Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers, in particular Spinoza, who, as I mentioned, was a big influence on him. And in 1837, he joined the Academia de Letran, and as a relatively still young person, he famously declared in his first speech, "There is no God, and natural beings are self-sustaining," which is the opening salvo that ultimately defined his intellectual life. Because this, uh, I mean, making this kind of statement in a college that had been up until very recently dominated by uh, uh, religious figures was nothing short of basically a complete provocation. And this is the tenor that ultimately set the life of Ignacio Ramirez. So after graduating from the college, he founded the periodical Don Simplicio. He obtained a law degree, but having no affinity for the practice of law, he turned to journalism and politics. In 1856, he was elected to the Constitutional Congress, and he helped, and this is very important, shape the 1857 Constitution, which was a liberal constitution that eliminated all traditional privileges, particularly the ones from the church. During the period of from 1858 to 1861, he served as Secretary of Justice for the President Benito Juarez. He oversaw the seizure of church property and secular curricular reform. And after the restoration of the Mexican Republic following the overthrow of the Second Mexican Empire that was ruled by the puppet Emperor Maximilian, he was appointed in the latter part of his life as magistrate of the Supreme Court, where he served basically until his death, while continuing to engage in very prolific literary activities, well, literary and journalistic activities. So let me talk now a bit about Ramirez's radical naturalism. And here is a citation from one of his later works, which is called Lecciones de Literatura. So this is what he writes: a group of cells, some alive and others barren. And here he has in mind basically the outermost layer of our skin, which is basically composed of dead cells. Some with extensions and others exposed. That is the animal called human. So human beings are basically just collections of cells. We are no different from any other living thing basically on Earth. So for Ramirez, human beings are complex biological machines subject to natural forces. Intelligence is not a supernatural gift, but it's a product of natural processes, the organizing faculty to harness the environment. And because of this, humans are part and parcel of the natural world, subject to exactly the same laws that govern all living things. And this is very important for him because, as we're going to see, this is going to give rise to his uh, social and political views. So there's two conditions for him that are necessary for human life. On the one side, there is what he calls receiving forces. So human beings, as organic creatures, must constantly receive both organic and inorganic elements, nutrients, sensations, and other environmental inputs that are pursued as either desirable for survival or well-being. And at the same time, there are what he calls disposing forces, which lead us to basically reject unwanted elements, such as waste, for instance, the waste that we produce. And since all humans share roughly identical physiological constitutions, these reactions tend to be similar across individuals, producing a powerful associative effect. And here there's a citation that uh, highlights this. When two or more living beings feel the same impressions, they're moved by the same desires. Mutual influence acting on all humans produces social institutions. So our biology, given basically the particular structure that it has, is responsible for the forms of social organization that we uh, construct according to El Nigromante. But according to him, there's a tension at the heart of human nature because Ramirez identifies two competing drives that are rooted in our animal nature. On the one side, there is what he calls a consumeristic drive, we as human beings are animals, and qua animals, we need to consume clothing, food, shelter, pleasures, and this tends to lead in some circumstances to hoarding. And certain laws tend to sanction hoarding, enabling fraud and violence. And here, one of the citations that he mentions is the famous uh, response that the Gaul leader Brennus gave to Romans after they were complaining that he was exacting too much tribute from them after he took Rome. Woe to the vanquished. Uh, in addition to this consumeristic drive, there is, according to Ramirez, an associative drive because human beings, in virtue uh, of basically having a social nature, we are driven to form free and spontaneous associations to resist oppressive laws and the domination of others, which is a counterforce to the consumeristic impulse. However, unlike Hobbes, who resolves basically this tension through a sovereign compact, Ramirez's solution taps into the associative drive to promote self-ruling free associations. And this is something that I think makes him a very interesting philosopher in the context of the 19th century. Why is this the case? Well, because Ramirez draws a very clear distinction between association and administration. And this is what he says with respect to association. Association demands equality. Administration is preserved through hierarchy. And this, he basically has Hobbes in mind. Sociability entails birth and changes of form. Every system of government tends to perpetuate itself even against the will. So for Ramirez, compacts such as the ones that Hobbes basically proposes in the Leviathan uh, involve basically the surrendering of self-governance to a sovereign, and this leads to a crystallization and hardening over time, which is, according to him, inadequate to ultimately uh, respond to a permanently changing environment. And in contrast, free associations remain flexible and egalitarian. And because of this, they're better suited to the transient and evolving needs of human communities, because human communities, in virtue of being composed by human beings who constantly change throughout their lives, are also constantly changing. And this is something that, according to Ramirez, Hobbes didn't quite see. So in virtue of this, for him, associations are the foundation of democracy. And Ramirez finds in the nervous system of human beings a natural model. Sensations basically converge to a common center, which is our brain, enabling complex coordinated behavior. And because of this, human associations mirror this biological process at a social level. And he gives several examples of this in his works. One example is that of early Christians, because according to him, before the establishment basically of a hierarchical church, the original church was a true democracy where people associated freely and where accumulation that didn't benefit the community was forbidden. He also finds an example of associations in worker unions that had begun to develop in the 19th century, because according to him, these are democratic communities in which members basically uphold mutual aid as a fundamental principle to resist authoritarian tendencies. And finally, the last example that he focuses on are international alliances, because he advocates the development of international worker alliances to prevent capitalists from exploiting foreign proletarians, which is something that shows very clearly that he was, in certain senses, way ahead of Marx and other thinkers in the 19th century. In addition, one of the other points that Ramirez basically really emphasizes is that associative democracy is of capital importance because it's crucial to develop individual autonomy. And he uses a specific thought experiment to argue for this. He imagines municipalities as essentially being fully emancipated from the central government. And in a locality such as Mazatlan, which is a town in the Pacific Ocean, the coast of the Pacific Ocean in Mexico, that was at the time being just a tiny locality. Now it's a much bigger hub. Ramirez imagines basically uh, a community free from federal interference, where neighbors would be able to experiment with self-governance, building bridges, managing water, growing trade, and testing industrial enterprises. And this is the vision that he basically has. And here I quote him: marshlands would disappear, bridges would span over creeks, pure water would flow in the square, trade would increase, and education would complete this picture of progress. So the idea is that within this community, um, um, within this community, uh, individual autonomy would be able to flourish. I'm going to try to speed up to thank you. Um, so another point that Ramirez makes is that true democracy cannot be legislated because law involves essentially coercion. So true democracy always has to basically consist at the basis on free associations of people. And because only through free associations of persons can develop what he calls a personal governing regime, which is uh, a notion of personal autonomy where one can be his own master, defending one's self-governance against any coercion from others. And one of the other points that he emphasizes is that spontaneity is essential for this. So this is why uh, democracy cannot be legislated, according to him, because it has to always spontaneously arise from uh, free associations. Um, Another point that he makes is education is basically the cornerstone of progress. And here he draws a basically really important distinction between instruction and education. Instruction for him is just mere rote learning, and education, in contrast, involves social intercourse, experiencing all the characters, all the circumstances, and experimentation. And this is very important because for him, the most important branch of education is gymnastic, understood as exercise. And what he means by this is that through repeated practice of speaking, reading, writing, uh, practicing music, algebra, and geometry, children basically lift themselves from the level of mere animality to develop genuine individuality. So, in virtue of this, education is ultimately crucial to develop self-knowledge and autonomy. And for him, this is very important because this will enable to uh, ultimately lower the existing gender and racial barriers that existed in Mexico in order to create a truly egalitarian society, a truly egalitarian Republican society. And one of the things that he also emphasizes is that schools and town councils are basically inseparable. They go together. Uh, Education and local democratic governance must be coupled together because education enables people to understand better themselves and their environment through experiential learning. And in a similar way, local democratic participation, particularly at the municipal level, the ayuntamiento or town council in Spanish, provides an area where autonomous individuals exercise self-governance and try different things. So in virtue of this, there is a synergy between the experimentation that takes place in schools and the experimentation that takes place at the level of town councils. So because of this, education should be extended to all, not just to men, but also to women, because this will be essential to their realizing all the potentialities that they do have, uh, and that would enable to break with the colonial structures in which women were essentially property. Education would ultimately also enable indigenous persons to really integrate the egalitarian republic that Ramirez envisions in an equal footing. And this positions Ramirez as uh, a key thinker that ultimately promotes the dissolving of race and gender barriers in 19th century Mexico. And just to basically conclude really quickly, there are very some striking parallels between Ramirez and John Dewey in virtue of the fact that both of them basically are very strong naturalists. Both of them also involve, defend a very robust conception of democracy. Both of them are advocates, basically, of education in order to basically achieve this democratic ideal. And both of them defend the importance of individuality, of developing true individuality as a way of participating fully in the democracy that they both aspire to create. And I think that these parallels between Dewey and Ramirez exist because both of them were trying to basically push back against the classical liberal view that was endorsed by people like John Locke or John Stuart Mill, that individuals are independent entities with fixed selves whose existence precedes their communities. And this is, I think, something that both Dewey and Ramirez got right, both. For both of them, human beings only become human in relation to the communities that they belong to, because our desires and values are crucially shaped by the communities that we live in. Uh, so I think that part of basically this common basically background of both of them being American thinkers in the hemispheric sense of the term, pushing back against this liberal European conception of individuals that is ultimately really mistaken, enabled them to really converge on the idea that human beings only become human in relation to the communities that they're born and live in. So I'm going to skip basically just to the conclusion for the sake of time. So Ramirez naturalism is the foundation of his entire philosophical system. Uh, from this naturalism emerges basically a view of associative democracy that is grounded on free association rather than legislation. And because this, according to him, enables to really preserve the flexibility that is necessary and allows us as to develop as true individuals. And because of this, there's also very strong parallels, as I try to show, between the thought of John Dewey, particularly regarding democracy and education, and that of Ramirez. And my conclusion is that because of this, Ramirez deserves a place in the broader history of philosophy as a thinker who anticipated many of the views that were developed within the pragmatist tradition in the 20th century. And with this, I conclude, and let me stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Um, Fantastic, very interesting, and an overlooked thinker. And now we will turn to Dr. Obed Frausto, who is presenting. The title is Pablo González Casanova, Radical Democracy Within the Internal Colonialism and New Sciences and Humanities. If you could.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to say thank you for the invitation, no, to participate in this conversation. And actually, the reason, the rationality about the papers that we are presenting today is because Sergio Gallegos and me, we were able to editing the an issue for the Radical Philosophy Review, which is about the radical Mexican philosophy, right? And this is the reason why we are presenting these two important authors for the Mexican radical tradition. So Pablo González Casanova, I mean, was more a contemporary philosopher, an intellectual sociologist, social scientist. So he actually he born in the 1922 and he passed away in 2023. So he basically lived more than 100 years and 1 year, with more precisely. And present what I want to do in this paper is presenting probably the core ideas, the most important ideas of Pablo González Casanova. But in the case that how I organize it is because, I always pursuing the connection and the relationship between power and knowledge. So when I was reading different fragments, books, sections of the Pablo González Casanova, because like he has been elaborating very extensively in because of his long life, uh, different moments, different stages. So there's a lot of fragments in the way that he's kind of developing their ideas through the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So for me, it was like I need to find out that connection between power and knowledge. So when I was reading the whole some of the materials over there, I realized like his emphasis was more politically, and this is the reason why I emphasize in the conception of the democracy. So in other words, at least in the way that I reading his work, is like democracy is kind of in the center, and then from that, all the categories that he developed in life, they were kind of in relationship or is inspired or based in this radical conception of democracy. So I want to conceptualize a little bit or explain a little bit his conception of democracy first, because there's like different stages in this conceptualization of democracy. I mean, of course, the first one is based in, like, first of all, in the 1950s, 1960s, the political reality of Mexico is like we have a whole political party. It's called the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which is like the political party that emerged after the Mexican Revolution. So they hold power for decades through the whole 20th century, right? So Pablo González Casanova is trying to understand, the reality of Mexico. So he ended up writing this fascinating book. It's called Democracia en Mexico, which is very famous for sociologists, right? Because he's trying to use sociological categorizations and conceptualizations for explaining the different parts and elements and characteristics of the Mexican political system right in the 1960s. So anyway, so what he ended up discovering or arguing in this book is like the problem with the democracy in Mexico is the conception of democracy in the 1960s is imposing a foreigner or external conception of democracy, a liberal democracy that is mostly can be applied to other types of countries. But when it's trying to be implemented in the particular case of Mexico, I mean, there's a lot of challenges and very difficulties to implement that kind of liberal democracy to Mexico. Specifically, the main reason is because in Mexico, and this is the main idea, it's a dual society, right? It's a dual society. So what does that mean? It means like in the particular case of the history of Mexico, it's like they are struggling between two different, a fighting between two historical Mexicans in a way that, there's more like a kind of an indigenous, uh, but not developed that in the terms of, like the Western conceptualization and this kind of modern society. So anyway, so there's like this kind of contradiction or this opposition between a more modern Mexican with the more traditional and more indigenous perspective that is kind of fighting. And this is kind of what is happening. He's kind of arguing that the case, the Mexican society is dealing and is struggling with this kind of dual society. So when they are imposing from the outside the liberal democracy, is not mashing well or is not resolving the main issues of marginalization, because like the framework for this liberal democracy is not actually resolving or is not acknowledging or is not even recognizing this kind of the contradiction or the paradox or the opposition that is kind of representing this traditional indigenous type of society, right? So anyway, so this is the reason why he kind of ended up developing this fantastic concept. I mean, it's not like his concept itself, because there's a whole history of the concept. The name of the concept is internal colonialism, right? I mean, it's an interesting concept because normally, historically, what is more recognized is the conception of colonialism, right? But the colonialism normally was a relationship between countries, right? Like normally from Europe, they used to have historically some colonies. So normally the conceptualization is a kind of a regional geopolitical relationship between countries or developed countries or countries of the north or third world countries versus the third world countries of the south or not developed countries, right? But anyway, but when he was kind of working in his Democracia in Mexico, recognizing the dual society. So he ended up recognizing that this paradox and the contradictions, it may be a form of a colonial expression. But the way that he kind of denominated is like an internal colonialism. So it's a type of colonialism that is going inside of a colonial country, right? So it's in other words, there's kind of regional, even in the country in Mexico, there's more kind of regional tensions, spatial tensions, geopolitical tensions in the interior of the country. That is kind of representing, like some colonial tension, the internal colonialism. I mean, the concept itself is historically, some people are tracing the origin of the concept in Lenin, in Gramsci, right in the 1914, but was mostly regional, like was more regional between, center regions of power versus, the countryside, external regional conception. Some other people actually talking about the internal colonialism, like, more racial, more a racial tension. Because like in some urban cities, like it's not region among regions, it's just like interactions between groups, social groups and groups. But anyway, so the particularity of this internal colonialism that was proposed by Pablo González Casanova has to do more with the political and the economic dimension, right? So it's a little bit beyond the the regional, the spatial stuff, but also the racial stuff, and it's kind of linked to the political and economical dimension. That is very interesting in this way, right? Because I think the something that I found interesting with the conception of the internal colonialism is there is always this interesting tension between the social classes, like I mean, of course, these social classes are is the there's like a frame, they are set in capitalism where you have a proletarian society, a proletarian class versus the bourgeoisie class, but at the same time, in the case of Mexico, of course, there is some elements of the indigenous groups, and also the no-indigenous or the Western or the most modernized groups in the case of Mexico. So there's a little bit of the tension of this. Wait a minute, I mean, Mexico is capitalism or is completely capitalism, or maybe there's some fragments or some sectors in the region that actually is not capitalism. It might be a form of feudalism, maybe it's not a form of feudalism, or maybe a more traditional type of society in which not every group is going through this kind of process of proletarization of the indigenous groups. Like there's like a fighting, there's a tension over there that you kind of the indigenous group, they are kind of fighting and keep it up for their own traditional ways of life. And then this is the reason why the internal colonialism is kind of dealing with the tension of probably the modern type of society, capitalist society, recognizing the tension between the process of proletarization, but at the same time, in this kind of dual society stuff is kind of pushing to recognizing the indigenous view, the indigenous traditional way, right? Indigenous traditional way. So anyway, so the concept itself, because remember, like Pablo González Casanova, I mean, he's trying to produce a sociology, like he's not a philosopher per se, he's a social scientist. So he's still using the concepts of the categorizations with the purpose of explanatory or explanations or definitions about what is currently happening, like in order to understand the social reality in that case. So the internal colonialism is a fascinating concept, in sociological concept to understand, like. the tension, the internal tension that we have in our society. So then, in the 1960s, and I think this is a Democracia in Mexico, and also, he's kind of proposing like a specific type of sociology that he defined like a sociology of exploitation, and then here has some specific tensions with, like what he calls a liberal scientific tradition. Like it is not like not only politically, there is like a firing of how the Europeans or the Western perspectives are imposing a political structure, but in the scientific dimension also, there's some kind of imposition from the Western or the European perspective imposing to the case of Mexico in a form of colonization. So the expression of that is a form of liberal scientific tradition that he has some problems with that kind of tradition, right? Specifically with the idea of neutrality and objectivity and methodology for this social scientist perspective, because it has a tendency to neutralize or not to really deal with the roots of the problems in the capitalistic society. For example, he's a little bit upset about how the liberal scientific tradition is defining, like the main differences between social classes and social groups. Normally, they tend to name that like a form of inequality, economic inequality. There's non-symmetries, between these groups. So, and this is the main purpose of why he's trying to produce a new type of sociology that he denominated sociology of exploitation, because what he wants to say is like, inequalities doesn't work very well because it's not really telling us what is really happening, which is like a form of exploitation for the capital system. There is some people, some elite is taking advantage, and of course is taking advantage, and of course is exploiting other groups for the favoring of the profit and the money, and having more better positions in the political hierarchy. So in this case, it would be very interesting the connection with Marx in his sociology of exploitation. But I think it is interesting how he's kind of reading Marx in this case, because of course the conception of exploitation is inspired directly by Karl Marx critical thinking, right? Because Marx is a critical philosopher that he's kind of explaining, the exploitation of the capital system, and he's literally saying how like one elite is taking advantage of the other social class. So anyway, so he's kind of linking to the idea of the sociology of exploitation, right? Because at the end, he's going to make a connection here that is this is how it's operating, right? And I think this, even though that the idea of exploitation is very interesting in the case of Karl Marx, but sometimes I feel like this kind of internal colonialism categorization here is very important, because I think it is kind of grasping a reality that, Karl Marx was not very interested in that, right? But specifically with the indigenous groups, or specifically with the more traditional type of societies that kind of survive in this kind of Western and modern types of society, right? Because at the end, like the process of the capitalism is always passing through this process of going through the feudalism, and the feudalism has to disappear in order to produce a new society like capitalism. So in order to get to another stage, which is like the socialism for Karl Marx, like it's necessary to have a new stage of capitalization, and then but the feudalism, or maybe a more traditional way of thinking, is kind of dismissed, is kind of a overview for the Marxist theory. So anyway, so I think going back to the dual society, the internal colonialism aspect is precisely what is recognizing something that even Marx didn't see, which is the idea here that yes, capitalism can operate in societies that they are not completely capitalistic. That actually they're kind of surviving, living with some more traditional ways of life based in the indigenous groups. Okay, so we have this thing, and I almost want to finish with this. I'm finishing with this. So anyway, So, of course, the conception of democracy evolved in the last decades of the 20th century. Is not the conception of the democracy that he's kind of elaborated in the 1960s. So at the end of the 20,000 and the beginning of the 21st century, he's kind of developing or adding more information for his initial conception of democracy, right? So the radical democracy that he's proposing here is inspired mostly in two things. One is like the efforts of Cuba, and this one is a little bit controversial in terms of, like maybe Cuba, the Cuban Revolution is not democratic, in the liberal terminology stuff. But at least for him, the role of Cuba is fascinating because it's like an anti-colonial force for Latin America, in terms of this kind of the American imperialism that happens in the second part of the 20th century. So the Cuba is important here because it's a force of anti-hegemonic and anti-colonial view. But as we know, in the 1990s, the Zapatista movement, of course, give it to Pablo González Casanova another interesting dimension in this radical democracy conception, right? Because the Zapatistas, is precisely these indigenous political movements that appears and happens in Chiapas, with some specific characteristics, of course, fighting the NAFTA, fighting and questioning, like the new trade uh, acceptance and agreement between the United States and Mexico in the beginning, at the end of the 20th century. But what is interesting is like the Zapatista is conceptualizing a categorization of democracy that is not necessarily has to deal with the state. Somehow it's kind of linking to some kind of form of anarchism, but also, recognizing the importance of the autonomies, like the space, some spatial dimension of anti-hegemonic political powers and political influences. So anyway, so this kind of Zapatista movement, I think, radicalized even more his conceptualization of democracy. And I want to finish with this. I only have a few minutes over here, because in the second part of the paper, what I want to do is how this radical conception of democracy from the Zapatistas' influence inspired to deal with the new theories in science that are denominated the complex theories, right? This is the reason why he's writing this amazing book. It's called The New Science and Humanities. And in that one, I think it is a very important one because, I mean, of course, the complex societies, the new types of societies are bringing contingency, are bringing radical conceptions of distinctions of no neutrality and no objectivity in sciences with the theory of systems, with the observer, right, like being modified, the observation being modified by the observer and is affected by the object being observed. The relationship of the cause is not linear, it's not deterministic, it's biodirectional, there's like a form of entropy and newness. So there's more chaos, more chaos in this kind of the new conception of the scientist. But the problem with that, and I have here 30 seconds, is like it's forgetting these new complex theories that they are coming mostly from the biology, the complexity of theories from the cybernetics, information theories, computational theories, is missing precisely the consent, the belief of emancipation and liberation that the Zapatistas are pursuing in their own fighting in this kind of radical democratization. So what he wants to try to do is like from the humanities then is proposing the idea that it's possible to establish in a radical democracy for sciences, natural science and social science in this interdisciplinary way, in which there is a whole participatory stuff to emancipate in a new horizon for science as a new way to combat fighting, like the techno-scientific structure that is validating the capitalism at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 20th century. So anyway, thank you so much for your attention, guys. So this is mostly the conclusion of my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, because we started late and have a hard out at 4, we're going to only have a little bit of time for discussion. Um, I have, so here's my thought. Maybe I give my thoughts on both of yours, certain questions that I have, and then you can answer in order, right? And so I'll start with you, Sergio, and then I'll say his, and then we can all just go. So when I found, I'm not familiar, obviously, with Enneagram, unfortunately. I need to familiarize myself, but I uh, there was one sticking point that I found interesting, which is
Hmm.
this radical naturalism has a rejection as a powerful associating effect. And my thought was that makes sense, but then I think, well, how does this tie into nationalism? Right? And you can
Hmm.
see how I could think that, right? Because yes, we are naturally associative, right? But highlighting rejection as a causing association inherently like sort of makes things ambiguous in terms of what we come together for. Now, you use examples of labor unions, but we can just as easily use nationalism. And I think, you know, we mentioned Marx, right? This is that tension that racked Marxism in the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Nationalism versus solidarity with other workers. So I wanted to sort of, I don't know, think about that a little bit. Um,
Yes,
um,
of course. Do you want me to answer this?
might as well, and then I'll get to Obed.
Yes, so very quickly, yes, there is indeed, and this is something that is really fascinating uh, I mean, at the core of El Nigromante, there are basically, according to him, there are two opposite basically impulses in human beings. On the one side, there's basically an associative basically impulse, and on the other side, there's a consumeristic one, which typically leads us to, as I said, hoard, according to him, and to ultimately be prone to vices that arise from hoarding, such as selfishness and uh, the establishment of barriers, basically, to establish solidarity with respect to others. And one of the things that El Nigromante basically advocates as a solution to this is basically lying or relying on the associative drive, the associative impulse, which is, according to him, also natural in us. And the way in which he envisions things is basically as a development of organic associations from the bottom up. So these associations have to be essentially to be built at the municipal level. Then from the municipal level, we can go to the state level, then to the national level, and ultimately, hopefully, at the end of the day, to the international level. And one of the very interesting things, according to him, is that the constructions of all of these free associations can take place in parallel ways. So you can basically begin constructing municipal associations by, participating in your town council meetings, and at the same time, you can and should, according to him, uh, engage basically in uh, through through labor unions, for instance, in establishing basically solidarity with other communities in which other people uh, are basically facing the same problems. And given that similar communities, basically in other parts of the world, also face similar challenges, you can and should, according to him, develop international bonds basically with them. And he recognizes that in certain cases, nationalism can be uh, a bit problematic, but for him, uh, the establishment of a nation state is only something which is a necessary stage, because at the end of the day, nation states will ultimately, according to him, dissolve or should dissolve in order to because the nation state is in a sense also something which is static, which is rigid, and this goes against basically the principle of free association that he really defends. So at the end of the day, what he would advocate for is the kind of is an establishment of a world government that would be composed by a series of free associations that are embedded in one another's like matryoshkas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And and
Hmm.
and by the way, so this is how I'm going to link both of your papers,
Hmm.
right? Because you say that, not just that we can, but we should, for example, form labor unions. And
Hmm.
and I think this is what makes him seem less liberal to me, because it sounds less like he's talking about rights, but responsibilities.
Yeah. Hmm.
And organization in terms of radical democracy is precisely that. And to tie this to Obed, Dr. Frost, is the model of Cuba and the model of the Zapatistas. I think both also look at responsibilities, right? I'm thinking of the literacy campaigns, for example, where people had to go to the countryside and help out, right? I believe that was in the 60s. I'm thinking of the Zapatistas, where uh, uh, the radical democracy actually requires you to be there, right? And so perhaps if you could speak a bit about that, Obed.
I'm sorry that you cut a little bit. So the last thing, the last part of the question, please.
Oh, no, it's just saying. So this looks like less like rights and then responsibilities, and that radical democracy, as envisioned by the two models you mentioned that Casanova uses, right, entail responsibility, namely like with the Cubans with the literacy campaigns, right, and the responsibility of the state to make sure that people can eat and there's a bare minimum. And in the case of the Zapatistas, where it's not just free democracy, you have to serve, right? You have to actually
Right.
go in, and this is part of radical democracy is it's it's a different vision of democracy than the one we're used to, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. I can add a little bit in that specific one. Like I think this is interesting. Because I feel one of the issues with or either way the liberal democracy or even the liberal scientific tradition is maybe the mechanism that is kind of associated to this kind of conception, right? Basically, in the conception of the substance, going back to this kind of the freedom, the liberty, how is the individual in this kind of liberalism of the 19th century? I don't know how Negromonte is. I mean, of course, he's using a different model, which is the organic model, which is there's more interactions between the particles and the elements. Even though that maybe for the case of Pablo González Casanova, he was inspired in the Marxism, but I think in the with this book that he wrote, Las Nuevas Ciencias y las Humanidades, in the 2004, I think he's kind of dealing with a new form of organism or new form of organism mechanism, right? Which is basically what is happening with the complex theories, the cybernetics, like Piaget, the theory of systems, Roberta Lanfi, and like the organic conceptions of Piaget, no, well, the biological guy. So I think what is interesting is like, of course, it's a new model. It's the mechanical and the organic here, but of course, the complexity, the entropy, the newness, like the new horizon is an interesting perspective over here because I think you're right. I don't think it has to be with this kind of element of freedom. I don't know if it is responsibility, but he kind of frame it like a form of affinity or maybe a form of paradoxes and contradictions, like more in this more relational way, like how this at the end there is like an articulation between individuals or particularities that eventually has to produce something that is new, not because it is given, but something because it's the new configuration is producing new. It has to produce something new in order to overcome, like the hierarchy of the capitalism. But I don't know. This is how I see it.
No, absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. We're just about at 4, so I'll give you a little buffer time. Once again, I want to thank you so much, Sergio. I want to thank you so much, Ovid, and I want to thank you all for watching us. I think, will come